This is the podcast of Reasonable Faith with Dr. William Lane Craig. Thank you so much for being here. We know you've been waiting to hear about all that's been going on in the life of Reasonable Faith with Dr. Craig, in particular these two major debates that have occurred not long ago. And now, Bill, we're at the Sam Harris debate. Another debate that was watched, anticipated, a lot of talk after it. Probably going to spend plenty of time on this. But why do you think these last two debates in particular have been important?
Well, I think Sam Harris in particular is an extremely high-profile figure and opponent of religious belief in American society. Next to Christopher Hitchens, he's perhaps the most rhetorical of the four horsemen of the new atheism, and has certainly been a popular best-selling author. And he was the fourth of these so-called four horsemen that I had yet to meet in a public encounter. I had already debated or dialogued with Hitchens and Dennett and Dawkins on previous occasions. And so to finally meet with Harris in an open debate situation was the culmination of a long period of waiting.
Very much a popular author. His book, The End of Faith, bestseller, Letter to a Christian Nation, another one.
Yes.
He's got a new book out, and it was the topic of the debate, The Moral Landscape. That really was the impetus for this debate with Sam Harris, because I know people have been calling for it for a while since The End of Faith came out and was such a popular book, and he was so popular as representative of the new atheism and emerging as a major spokesperson and having this big platform. So this has been some time in coming. It is telling that Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, which put him on the map, was begun the day after 9/11. And so while you can't fault the content of the book because of that, it definitely was a visceral reaction against religion because of what happened on 9/11.
Yes, and Christian conservatives tended to be tarred with the same broad brush as Islamic jihadists. And that sort of lumping of all religious people together has been very characteristic of the new atheists.
The Moral Landscape was a book that really needed to be debated, in that this is an area of work for you as well. And the fact that Sam Harris, as an atheist, believes that there are objective morals, I think that really made for an interesting debate, too.
I did, too. That was one reason I was eager to debate the topic with him, because he affirms both that objective moral values and duties do exist. He inveighs against what he calls these overeducated moral nihilists and relativists who deny the objectivity of moral values and duties. And moreover, Kevin, he significantly thinks that there needs to be a foundation for objective moral values and duties. He's not happy to simply say they are brute facts that simply hold. Rather, he wants to provide an explanation or justification for the objectivity of moral values and duties in science. And so this just set the platform for a great debate, because we would have so much in common. We would both come to the debate affirming the reality and objectivity of moral values and duties, and the need for some sort of an explanatory foundation for the objective moral values and duties that exist. And so given that common ground, you have the makings for a really interesting debate.
What's interesting also is how so many people, Christians, non-Christians, Christians, atheists, the new atheists, tend to overlook the content, the content of the debate so often, because there's an excitement about the competitive nature of this. And the sides are picked and the battle lines are drawn. And you know from Sam's opening statements that he said, I've received so many emails from people saying, don't blow this. Don't blow this. You know, Dr. Craig is a force to be reckoned with. He paid you a compliment there, that you put the fear of God in atheist thinkers. I also know behind the scenes a little that he received all this coaching. Now be ready for this. I've got to say, because of all that, Bill, what emerged to me as I watched the debate unfold was that his strategy tended to be, I'm not going to play along with the control of this debate, and I'm going to get out the things that need to be said, and that is a railing against Christianity.
Yes.
What we saw there was a litany of red herrings. Then you came back and said, look, what's up with all the red herrings? So the rebuttal was, I'm just going to tell you straight up, it's as if Sam went to a junior high campus, nothing against junior hires, gathered up all the oppositions and objections to Christianity and then read them out. Now, I'm just going to have to say, I don't appreciate that strategy because he used a bully platform, in my opinion, and he took advantage of this to get out his pet peeves against the Christian faith and religion in general by going through all of these things that had nothing to do with the points that you made.
Or with the topic for the debate that evening.
The topic for the debate.
The topic of the debate was, is the foundation of morality natural or supernatural? This was the topic that he and I both agreed upon in our email correspondence with Michael Ray, the organizer of the debate, prior to the debates being held. And that topic is significant, Kevin, because the question, is the foundation of morality natural or supernatural, presupposes that there is an objective morality, and significantly, it presupposes that it has a foundation. It just simply has to identify what that foundation is. So the terms of the debate topic were quite clearly stated and had nothing to do with doctrines of hell or Christian particularism or the other sorts of red herrings that
unevangelized, yes,
wanted to raise.
Now, I'm not speaking for you. Let the listener understand. I'm giving my analysis right now, Bill. It was akin to someone coming out and in rebuttal saying, your mother wears army boots, okay? The leap from is to ought. Now, that's one of the most anticipated things that people were wanting him to do. Can he make that leap? Well, do you think he did?
Well, I didn't hear a response to that, Kevin. I was taking pretty careful notes. In fact, if I might say, one of the things that struck me in seeing some of the clips from the debate afterward is that whereas I take very careful notes on what my opponent says so as to respond to his particular points, Harris didn't appear to be taking notes at all on my arguments, on what I was saying. He just seemed to be sort of sitting there and then getting up and, as you say, kind of giving his spiel, but not really engaging in the arguments under debate. And that's part of the responsibility of a debater, is to clash with the opponent's arguments. You're obligated in a debate to engage the arguments that your opponent has offered. And he seemed to decline to do that and seemed to think that that was a clever strategy. So
I just noticed a little bit of typing into his laptop, and it was probably Wikipedia.com. Now, I'm just being antagonistic, but come on. These points on a book that he's been very careful to write needed some response.
Oh, they did. And a book that I was very careful in reading and analyzing and attempting to interpret charitably, attempting to understand what he was saying, because sometimes it wasn't always clear. Some of his statements seemed to be contradictory. So I tried to understand his moral theory and then to offer a critique of it. And I had 3 points by way of criticism of his moral theory, one of which I presented as a knockdown argument against the theory. It's what he calls the value problem. That's his own label for this problem in his editorial in the Huffington Post. In response to his many critics, he identifies this as the value problem. And I argued that his answer to the value problem was not simply inadequate, but that there was a knockdown objection here to his moral theory with respect to the value problem.
Let's camp on that a little bit.
Well, all right. And then in addition to that, I had 2 objections to his views of moral duties as well, but we can talk about those later if you want.
Well, let's keep it going. Because it's not very often, as you said in the debate, that you can find a knockdown argument philosophically. Let's understand where that was, and it had to do with identity.
Yes, that's right. It's in answer to the question, why on naturalism or atheism should we think that there are objective moral values rather than just subjective values that human beings hold? Why think that there really are objective moral values? And the way Harris answers that question is by redefining the word good to mean the flourishing of conscious creatures or the well-being of conscious creatures. So that to ask, why is on atheism the flourishing of conscious creatures good, is on Harris's understanding like asking, why is the flourishing of conscious creatures the flourishing of conscious creatures? It just doesn't even make sense to ask such a question, because you've just defined your terms in such a way that the good or a good means the flourishing of conscious creatures. So this is a critical move in his moral theory, is redefining the word good to simply mean the well-being of conscious creatures, so that now the question becomes pointless. Why think that the flourishing of conscious creatures is good on atheism? And the problem is that he admits that it's possible that the moral landscape, that is to say the highs and lows of moral value, good at the peaks and bad at the valleys, that moral landscape, he said, could fall apart from the landscape of creaturely well-being. You could have a possible world in which the peaks of well-being were occupied by morally evil people, rapists and thieves and psychopaths, people like that. And in that case, he says, he admits this in his book, that his so-called moral landscape would no longer be a moral landscape. It would just be a continuum of creaturely well-being, but it wouldn't map morality. It wouldn't map the moral landscape. So what that means is that it's possible that goodness and creaturely well-being are not identical after all. Well, as any logician would tell you, identity is a necessary relationship. For example, there is no possible world in which 3 is not equal to the square root of 9. These are necessarily identical, 3 and the square root of 9. If there's any possible world in which 2 things are not identical, then they're not in fact identical, because identity is a necessary relation. So by admitting that there's a possible world in which the continuum of creaturely well-being is not the moral landscape, he admits that these are in fact not identical after all, that goodness is not identical with the flourishing of sentient creatures. And that means the whole moral theory collapses, because that is at the center of his moral theory, is the identity of those 2 properties.
Now, he's a philosopher. Did he understand this?
That's a real question. He has an undergraduate degree in philosophy. He's a neuroscientist. I don't know if he understood it. He has been posed the value problem, as I say, by his critics. He recognizes that it's a problem, but he doesn't get beyond the simplistic answer of saying, I've redefined good just to mean the well-being of conscious creatures. I'm not aware of anybody who has pointed out this self-contradiction in his book that occurred to me as I read it. So I felt that this was, as I say, not just a good objection, this is a knockdown objection to his moral theory, and he owes his critics some sort of a response to this. You can't just pretend that it wasn't said in the debate and go blithely on.
Well, once again, his response was, in essence, Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. That's like he was applauded for being bold by not playing Bill Craig's game and getting his barbs in there, making sure that he got his sugar sticks and his pet peeves there.
Yeah, I saw one blogger who thought it was great that at a Catholic university he really stuck it to the Catholics by insulting their views of Mary and transubstantiation and so forth. And I thought, gosh, this person doesn't understand what academic debate is about. It's about argument and counter-argument on specific issues of importance, and not just scoring points and rhetorical jabs.
It's cynical. To applaud cynical jabs and saying he stuck it to those Catholics and he didn't play Bill Craig's game and he got those needed barbs in there. Well, why not go all the way and just turn around and moon the audience? Just drop your pants and moon the audience, and then you'll really stick it to them. Logically, that's what you're doing if you're not going to engage the topic of the debate and then try to answer what's on the table. It seems that he's trying to get from science can measure flourishing.
Yes.
And so that somehow can give us a scientific basis for objective morality.
Exactly, Kevin. I think you're right on target. And as I said in the debate, I don't have any quarrel with the claim that science can tell us a good deal about what contributes to the flourishing of the human species on this planet, just as science can tell us a great deal about what contributes to the flourishing of corn or mosquitoes or rats. Of course, science can tell us a lot about what conditions would be conducive to the flourishing of sentient life on this little planet. But what I challenged him to show, and what I frankly don't see, is why on naturalism we should identify the flourishing of conscious life on this planet with goodness.
Who has he read in moral theory?
In the Huffington Post article, where he responds to book reviewers, that's where he gives the most substantive interchange with some professional philosophers and ethicists, not so much in the moral landscape as in this Huffington Post editorial. He does try to answer some of his critics. The book, Kevin, was, if not uniformly panned, just very widely panned. It was given very negative reviews by professional philosophers and ethical theorists. And so I'm not alone in making these criticisms. And he did attempt to give some interaction and response to them in that editorial piece.
I guess more importantly, as a neuroscientist, did you see how neuroscience and the future of neuroscience would play into any of this?
A lot of it was hand-waving. He admitted that a lot of this is still speculative, but he would insist that that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think that the flourishing of conscious life on this planet isn't good, and that as we learn about brain states, that this will give added insight into what brings about human flourishing. But there wasn't a whole lot of specific content, frankly.
You said at the beginning of the debate that the debate topic was not to prove God exists or to give evidence for God, but that God played into it. What was your strategy there?
Well, my strategy, Kevin, was not to allow the debate to turn into a debate over God's existence, because then I would be giving cosmological arguments and fine-tuning arguments and arguments from the resurrection, which are just only tangentially relevant to his book, The Moral Landscape, and the question of the foundation of moral values. So rather than try to prove the existence of God, which would just make it another debate like so many I've been in, I wanted to argue conditionally that if theism is true, then we have a sound foundation for morality. But if atheism is true, then we do not have a sound foundation for morality. And so this will present us with a very stark choice between theism and atheism in terms of the debate question, is the foundation of morality natural or supernatural?
But it seems at times that he tried to draw you into that debate, and rather than let it go, which you had been in all your rights to do because it wasn't on topic when this stream of red herrings came out, you just said, look, if you want to debate this topic, we will. And if you're wondering about some of the things that Mr. Harris is saying here, there's a good book out by Paul Copan.
Yes.
And then you got back to the...
Right. I thought about this, Kevin. What should I do if he brings up all of these red herrings? And the danger is, if you don't say anything about them, then it leaves the audience with the emotional impact of the objection. But if you give in and you start following those red herrings down that other path, you will lose the thread of the argument. That is to say, you'll wander off topic and you'll get enmeshed in an endless debate of irrelevancies, and the central issues in the debate will be lost. So I felt that what I had to do was identify them as red herrings, refuse to be distracted, and then just refer the students to some additional resources on our website, as well as Paul Copan's book, which I had physically with me to show them, and hope that that would at least give the students some indication of where they might go if they did want to explore those issues further, but then to just leave it at that and live with whatever emotional consequence there was and return to the topic for debate, because I wanted to defend my contentions and especially to hammer home the inadequacies of his ethical theory.
Bill, I just have a question for anyone who is applauding what Dr. Harris did at this point to go off on this litany of red herrings and what I call hillbilly theology and shallow objections. Is that what you want debate to become? I would ask that. Is that where you want intellectual discourse? Do you want it to become cynical, snide, competitive, one-upmanship, zingers, and best lines of the night? Then bring a comedian in. Because a comedian could, that's all Bill Maher could do. He'd come up with a funny line.
Yes.
He'd give the junior high objections to the Christian faith and then give you some zingers. Okay, it's entertaining, but come on.
Yeah, honestly, Kevin, although this may be surprising to some of the people in the free thought community, my sincere interest is having a substantive exchange of ideas on these important questions and not just scoring rhetorical points or winning a debate. I thought I had very interesting criticisms of Harris's moral theory that I really wanted to press and was anxious to hear how he would respond. And so my interest is in having a real, honest-to-goodness, substantive debate. And that was what the organizers of the debate wanted, Kevin. They had a debate there last year at Notre Dame, and it was one of these rhetorical, fluffy slugfests. And Michael Ray, who is a professor of philosophy at Notre Dame, said when he asked me to debate Harris, we would like to have a more substantive, intellectually responsible discussion this year. Students at the University of Notre Dame are all required, no matter what their major, to take 2 philosophy courses and 2 theology courses as part of their undergraduate education. So this is a fairly sophisticated audience. And Michael Ray and the organizers of the debate felt that they owed it to the students to give them a more substantive intellectual exchange than they had had last year. And that was what I was anxious to do.
Bill, this is the first time that I've seen you actually get a little bit perturbed. You were calm, civil, but especially with the questions that started coming up. I mean, first of all, you saw that obviously there weren't going to be substantive responses, but there was going to be kind of a demagogic bully platform. That's enough to say, oh, come on, let's salvage this. But then the questions that people started coming up and asking.
Yes, everybody has commented on the level of the questions that were asked. And I think what needs to be understood is that these were not necessarily University of Notre Dame students. The Michiana Skeptics Society from southern Michigan and northern Indiana were there in force, and they go for the mics right away when the Q&A time comes up. And you could see from the level of the questions that this was really, I think, one of the poorest Q&A periods that we've ever had following one of my debates.
Yeah, and I don't think there's really been a debate that you've just said, look, I'm not going to dignify that with an answer. It's obvious what you're trying to do here. And the moderator
it was a
also,
setup. It was clearly not a sincere question, but was designed to trap me. And I'm just not going to play that game.
Once again, I'm going to ask the so-called free thought community, the new atheist community that's growing in this country, is that what you want? You pride yourself, allegedly, at least the free thinkers of the past have been, on thinking and wanting to get at truth. I don't see that anymore. Have you moved away from that, my free thought friends? Have you moved away from wanting to get at truth and civil discourse and intellectual stamina and engagement. But Bill, a lot of this is because with the growth of any movement grows the fringe. With the growth of the new atheism comes the growth of village atheism. And we're seeing a spate of village atheism now. Our atheist friends are going to get a dose of your own medicine because we've always had to put up with the fringe in the Christian world.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Well, as much as I've protested about Sam Harris getting off topic and some poor rebuttals and things like that, there were some good things that came out of this debate. So let's discuss that next time on Reasonable Faith with Dr. William Lane Craig. We'll see you then. Welcome to the Reasonable Faith Podcast. Let's continue talking about the Sam Harris debate with Dr. William Lane Craig. Bill, again, these two debates back to back, a lot of preparation on your part. I just want to ask you for the outset, where did this atheism movement come from? And I'll preface that by saying, for so long, it seems the church concentrated on the cults, aberrant Christian theology, the New Age. We were totally sidetracked and preoccupied with Satanism in the 70s, off doing battle against the forces of darkness in the cults and in the New Age and in Satanism, and a lot of that was not even a substantial threat. There were a lot of rumors and things like that. But atheism just kind of slipped on through. In Christians' mindset, in American Christianity, atheists were just so far gone, they were off the radar. That was Madalyn Murray O'Hair and her crazy rantings. Now, all of a sudden, you have fresh, younger, good-looking Sam Harris, articulate, suave, debonair Dawkins, and this more of a youthful movement that does not resemble in any way, shape, or form the old Madalyn Murray O'Hair movement or the depressing stuff that Nietzsche wrote and all this. But all of a sudden, this is big.
I think that's an excellent question, and I'm not a sociologist, so not really qualified to answer it. I would love to see a sociological study on the roots of the new atheism. I think probably the collapse of traditional middle-class morality and rejection of authority that occurred during the 1960s and the sort of alienation that was characterized during the Vietnam period probably provided a seedbed for a lot of this rejection of traditional views of God and morality and the values of the older generation. Probably a lot of that was laid, the groundwork was laid by the radicals of the 1960s, I think. And then in a longer perspective, the long influence of positivism and scientific naturalism during the 30s and 40s. I am still amazed, Kevin, when I enter into a debate with someone like a Lawrence Krauss at how the epistemology of old-time verificationism and logical positivism still casts its long shadow over Western culture in people idolizing science and thinking that science is the only source of knowledge and the only arbiter of truth. So some of those currents, I think, would come to expression in the new atheism, and the heightened awareness of militant Islam provided the sort of, I think, explosive power for this to surface and provide a backlash against religious belief.
And for the first time in history, with the internet, suddenly there's a platform, certainly there's a way to get together to form communities. And in all groups do that. I mean, we've had church. Our poor atheist buddies, they've been sitting in their basements and occasionally going to the bar. Well, I'm being funny. But there certainly hasn't been a sense of fellowship and community, and those things can, like anything else, cause some spread. But Bill, you spend an inordinate amount of your time attacking the philosophy of atheism. Why? I mean, you don't spend a lot of time on Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, or anything like that. And in the church, I'm sure, and Christians ask you, well, Bill, why are you messing with those guys?
I've sensed right from the start, Kevin, when I became a Christian and then went to Wheaton College, that the real cultural force of opposition to Christian belief wouldn't be from the cults like Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Science and Mormons that, as you say, so many Christian apologists at that time seemed to be focused on.
That's all we did.
Rather, it would be the forces of secularism that were so already triumphant in Europe and we're now, I think, increasingly influencing American society as well. I think Francis Schaeffer saw that very clearly, and as one who had his teeth cut on Francis Schaeffer, I suspect that that was why I saw that also as the principal challenge to be answered.
Well, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, New Agers, Satanists, these guys, I'm not lumping all of them into Satanism or anything like that. I'm just saying that where so much of the concentration have gone in apologetic outreach of the past, they're as marginalized as Christians are. I mean, the media go to the university for its resources, sound bites. So the academy is 10,000 times more influential on culture. And that's where atheism is. These other religious movements and cults are just marginalized. So even though in the past there's always been such a minority of people who were self-identifying as atheists, not only is that growing now, but they packed a bigger wallop. They made a bigger impact than any poor Jehovah's Witness could ever do.
Yes, I think that's true because they have become ensconced in the university. And again, I think, frankly, this is a reflection of the revolution that took place during the 1960s and the rise of radicalism on our university campuses then. Those folks went on and got professorships in departments of literature and humanities and religious studies, frankly, women's studies and so forth. And those are now our university professors, and many of them are deeply committed to a secularist mindset and worldview.
Well, many have seen this coming. You've certainly seen it coming for a long time. We're here. I think that it's very important that you're targeting these philosophical underpinnings, exposing them and trying to interact with them in the academy, in the universities.
Yeah, that's right, Kevin. I could fill my schedule with Christian conference speaking and church speaking, and I choose not to do that because the venue that I want to speak on is the secular university campus. Our state universities and private secular universities, that's where I want the debate to be joined.
Let's go through some of Sam Harris's responses then. Dr. Harris says, writing after the debate, I've received a fair amount of criticism for not rebutting his remarks point for point. Generally speaking, my critics seem to have been duped by Craig's opening statement in which he presumed to narrow the topic of our debate. Harris says, I later learned that he insisted upon speaking first and made many other demands. You can read an amusing behind-the-scenes account here. It gives a link. Okay, let's just address that first.
Well, this was all a matter of negotiation. It wasn't a matter of making demands. I wasn't in any position to make demands. I could only make requests. And so I proposed the typical format that I participate in when I do debates, 20-minute, 12-minute, 8-minute, and 5-minute speeches for each debater, and he was all right with that. And then we had to decide on a topic, and Michael Ray proposed several topics, and I said, how about is the foundation for morality natural or supernatural? And everyone liked that topic, including Sam Harris, so we agreed on that topic. So it wasn't a matter of demanding anything. It was a matter of, well, is this a mutually agreeable topic and format? And it was. As far as the timing was concerned, Kevin, I was rather amused by this because when I arrived the day before the debate, I found that the organizers were so loosey-goosey about this that there wasn't even a timekeeper for the debate. And I said, but how are we going to know when our 12 minutes or 8 minutes is up if there isn't any timekeeper? You always have a timekeeper who sits down in the front row with time cards so that you know how much time you've got left to speak. And Michael Ray says, oh, well, when you've got 1 minute to go, I'll interrupt you and say, 1 minute, please. And I said, well, Michael, rather than sort of interrupting the speaker, how about if we just have a timekeeper with time cards who will sit down in the front? And that way we can see how much time we have left. And so Dr. Ray got his 13-year-old son to serve as the timekeeper. His son had a stopwatch. And as you noticed during the debate, Michael would look at his son very pointedly, make sure he's ready, begin. And the son, would hit the stopwatch, and then we could see the time cards as he held them up. So it was rather funny to have this kind of put together at the last minute. But honestly, there's nothing sinister here. It's just a matter of...
It's extremely important, and things can go terribly wrong if you get the timing off. You can't keep the time yourself. You've got to concentrate on your delivery and things like that. I read the link that Sam Harris gave here, and all it says is that you were insistent that time was kept and that you wore your signature suit and tie. I don't find anything amusing.
The fellow who wrote the article, Nathan Schneider, he's actually doing a book for the University of California Press on the revival of Christian philosophy in our day and age. And that's how he happened to be at the University of Notre Dame for this debate. And so writes this nice article kind of with a peek behind the scenes of the students who organized it and everything of that sort. And as you say, I was definitely alarmed when I found out there was no timekeeper for the debate. And so they quickly put one together. In terms of going first, again, that was just mutually agreeable. The affirmative usually goes first in a debate.
First and last, usually. I wonder
well, no, that's true in an academic debate. Yes,
Yeah.
Usually the negative gets two speeches together in the middle, so the affirmative goes last as well as first. But we didn't do that. I just opened with arguing for God as the foundation of morality, and then he got the last word.
Okay.
And he didn't have any problem with that, so that was fine.
Quoting Sam Harris, those who expected me to follow the path Craig cut in his opening remarks don't seem to understand the game he was playing. He knew that if he began, here are 5 bogus points that Sam Harris must answer if he has a shred of self-respect. This would leave me with a choice between delivering my prepared remarks, which I believe to be crucial, or wasting my time putting out the small fires he had set. If I stuck to my argument, as I mostly did, he could return the next round to say, you will notice that Dr. Harris entirely failed to address points 2 and 5. It is no wonder because they make a mockery of his entire philosophy. Again, this smacks of coaching and emailing from Craig debate watchers that came into him. But again, because you went first, did you therefore have the advantage of setting the tenor or the tone, and then he had to play along?
The affirmative speaker who goes first gets to set his contentions out, which he will defend in the debate. And so that's what I did. I said, here are the 2 contentions that I'll defend in tonight's debate, and here are my arguments for them. But you notice, Kevin, that I don't speak in the kind of tendentious and pejorative language that Sam Harris suggests there, that if Harris has a shred of self-respect, he will answer these bogus points. That's really quite incorrect. That's not the way I handle myself. I handle myself as a gentleman in these debates and treat my opponent with respect and treat his arguments seriously. Okay. And what the negative speaker is obliged to do in a debate is to answer the case that the affirmative speaker has put forward. That is what debate is about. And so by refusing to engage with my case, he, in effect, abdicated his role in the debate. In fact, after his opening speech, I thought, well, this debate is over. He doesn't have anything to say. Now, that doesn't mean that, therefore, one gets up and proclaims victory or anything of that sort. But you do point out to the audience, because the audience isn't taking notes, they need to be reminded of your points. And so you point out to the audience, here are my 3 arguments, my 3 criticisms of his view, and here is how he then has responded to each one, and review this in the audience's mind. And if he hasn't responded yet, you point that out and invite him in the rebuttal speech then to give his response. And the odd thing about Harris's deportment in the debate was that he not only didn't respond in his opening constructive speech, but he didn't even bother to respond in the rebuttal speeches. He never got around to responding to my 3 criticisms of his moral theory.
Harris goes on, as I observed once during the debate, but should have probably mentioned again, Craig employs other high school debating tricks to mislead the audience. He falsely summarizes what his opponent has said. He falsely claims that certain points have been conceded. And in our debate, he falsely charged me with having wandered from the agreed-upon topic. Well, you can blame me too, because I think he did too. The fact that
I think clearly, Kevin, that he was introducing a lot of red herrings because it isn't essential to divine command morality to believe in things like the Christian doctrine of hell, or in thinking that all of the unevangelized are damned, or transubstantiation, or these other doctrines. Those are just irrelevant to the question, is the foundation of morality natural or supernatural?
he says the fact that such tricks often work is a real weakness of the debate format, especially one in which the participants are unable to address one another directly.
I want to say something, Kevin, in defense of the debate format, because I think that the problem with so many of these other fellows that I've debated is that they are used to giving lectures where no one from the other side is on the platform to challenge them, and so they get a free pass. And they, frankly, are simply not used to having their views seriously challenged, objections posed to them, and then being required to give answers to those objections. I find that these fellows are just not ready to do that. And so I think it is the genius of the debate format, that it is the unique format in which both sides of an argument are given a level playing field, and the other person is called to account for his views and how he would respond to objections to those views. I don't know of any other format that has that kind of advantage to it. Certainly, giving a lecture and answering audience questions doesn't call a speaker onto the carpet in that way that a debate format does.
Anybody who wants to do away with structure and organization and fairness and levelness in a debate do not know what they're asking for. They're asking for really chaos. I mean, this is what keeps people often talking past one another and shouting one another down and not giving the other person a chance to reply. And the more boisterous or extroverted of the two would have the advantage. And, there's a myriad amount of problems if you just have a free-for-all. I mean, I remember when you and Parsons sat down and kind of had an exchange. Even that was moderated by our friend Kirby Anderson. But even then, it was difficult to not step on one another, and the audience began to get into it and applaud, and you couldn't hear the other response. I mean, there were things like that. So
sometimes I will, as in the Parsons debate, participate in a cross-examination debate. This is not unusual, and I enjoy that, and audiences often enjoy that a great deal. I think just this year, my debate with George Williamson at the University of Saskatchewan was a cross-examination debate where we had a chance to ask questions of each other. And that can be a component of a debate. And I'm perfectly willing to engage in that. I think that can be very interesting.
Some good points have been made, too. In the exchange with Wolpert, one of the great misunderstandings about the nature of God was able to be pointed out you were able to point it out because of the one-on-one exchange you were having. So it's not all lost.
Think of the moderated discussion with Peter Atkins and William F. Buckley Jr., where I said there are all kinds of truths that science can't discover. And Atkins said, well, like what? And I ticked off 5 areas of truth that science was impotent to discover. And Buckley says, put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah, I mean, that was
just hilarious. So I'm quite happy to have these kinds of interactive formats as well. But what I disagree with is the idea that most of these fellows do, and that is just give solo lectures where no one is present to challenge their views. That's giving them a pass.
Anyway, Bill, those are just complaints about the format and so on. I think the format of a debate is, like you, very important that we maintain. And this is a very ancient art form, very ancient learning tool that's been around for just centuries, hasn't it?
Right. In the Middle Ages, the so-called disputed questions, questiones disputate, was a regular medieval forum for getting at issues of this sort.
Let's get back to your objections and responses to the claims that Dr. Harris is making. Now,
right. Well, the first of these, you remember, concerned his attempt to ground moral values, what he calls the value problem, on naturalism. And I argued that he had a knockdown argument for showing that, in fact, goodness is not identical with the flourishing of sentient creatures, as he claimed. But then in addition to that, there's the question of moral duties and how do you ground objective moral duties? And this has to do with the question of moral obligation and prohibition, things that we ought or ought not to do. And on atheism, Kevin, it's very difficult in the first place to see any source for objective moral duty because there is no divine lawgiver or commander. Obligations arise as a result of imperatives that have been issued. And in the absence of anyone to issue these sort of moral imperatives, it just doesn't seem there's any grounds for moral duty on atheism. Now, Harris tries to derive moral duties from science. And here my objection was that science is descriptive, not prescriptive.
Describes doesn't prescribe.
Right. And
describes
so as
what
a result,
people do.
Science can't derive an ought from an is. It can only tell us what is the case, but not what ought to be the case. And therefore, even if we agree that, say, creaturely flourishing is good, that does absolutely nothing to show that we have a moral duty to promote creaturely flourishing.
And then you pointed out ought implies can. Now, is that just what it means, that if you ought to do something, that implies that you can do it?
Yes. Puppets or machines don't have moral obligations, do they? Because they have no ability to act in response to moral obligations or prohibitions. They just run. And so in the absence of freedom of the will, there is no moral responsibility. As I said in the debate, if somebody shoves you into another person, you're not morally responsible for running into that other person. You didn't have any choice about it. You were pushed. So ought implies can. Now, the difficulty is here that Harris is a determinist. He makes it very clear in his book that he thinks that everything we think and do is causally determined, and he rejects not only libertarian freedom, Kevin, he rejects even compatibilistic freedom. He says, in no sense are we free beings. Well, that simply makes moral responsibility and therefore moral duty impossible. It's just logically impossible that we would have objective moral duties of any sort, given that there is no freedom of any kind. And that, again, seems to me to be an absolutely knockdown objection to his view that on naturalism, objective moral duties do exist.
What is the difference between someone who holds to libertarian free will and a compatibilist?
Well, both of them would say that we are free, but the libertarian would say that freedom is incompatible with being causally determined to do something, whereas the compatibilist would say you can be causally determined to do something, but you still do it freely. And I think that's because the compatibilist redefines freedom to mean you do it voluntarily. It's not that you do it as a result of an indeterminate choice of your will. You are determined causally to do it, but it's not as though you're constrained against your will to do it. You do it voluntarily, even though you're determined to do it. But Harris, I think, quite rightly rejects compatibilistic freedom, and he also rejects libertarian freedom, so he is just a classic determinist.
Dr. Craig, Sam Harris's book, as you have pointed out, has been panned by the critics. Anecdotally, there's been a lot of criticism of the book, but a lot of people anticipated it because it seems that Sam Harris wanted to fill a gap in moral knowledge lacking in the secular movement or in secular thought. One of the main things some of my atheist friends says, well, when they heard the book was coming out, we wonder if he's going to be able to get from is to an ought. We'll read the book and see.
That was the project, wasn't it? And he is reacting against the sort of moral nihilism of a person like Richard Dawkins, who says we are just machines for propagating DNA, and there is no good, there is no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference. And Harris says that view is morally unconscionable. And he gives the example of the genital mutilation of little girls. He says when this is done. The only question is how severely such a person should be punished, quoting from Donald Simons on this point. But he thinks it's clearly, objectively, morally wrong to do such a thing. And he is really quite against his fellow atheists or secularists who are nihilists and relativists. He is a staunch objectivist about morality, and so he wants to provide some basis in science for it.
Oh, you took Sam Harris to task for talking about how you're a psychopath to believe some of these things that Christianity teaches and theism teaches and so on. You took him to task for saying that. And Harris claims that he wasn't calling people psychopaths in the debate, but that he...
In his books, Kevin, he characterizes religious belief as a form of mental illness. And he certainly intimates, at least, that people who are religious believers manifest some kind of psychopathy or other sort of mental derangement.
Delusion. Yeah.
Well, stronger than that. I mean, a form of mental illness. And it seemed to me that such a claim is just, it's stupid, frankly. It's just silly. And the examples I gave were a couple of my University of Notre Dame colleagues in the philosophy department there, people like Peter Van Inwagen and Thomas Flint, of whom it would be simply silly to say that these are mentally ill people.
Well, Bill, wrapping up today, I've criticized Sam Harris's approach. Others have. You were disappointed in the red herrings and things like this. If you could do the debate again, or if another one could be scheduled maybe in the future or something, what would you want Sam Harris to do differently? How would you want him to respond?
Well, I would want him to engage with my arguments, but I hope, Kevin, that you don't have the impression, and I don't want to give listeners the impression, that I didn't enjoy this debate or that I didn't think it was great. I thought it was a fantastic evening, and I was delighted in how it went. I thought it was terrific, and I was very pleased that the criticisms that I offered held up as far as I'm concerned. So I would do it again. I would be happy to have another debate with him, and I would just hope that he would engage more with the arguments that I give. If he doesn't, then we'll just have a repeat of the same sort of shadowboxing.
Again, as you pointed out, you're taking notes on the other speaker and ensuring whether he replies to your points.
My opponent can be guaranteed that I will respond to the points that he makes that are relevant to the topic under consideration.
If you just have an empty page there when you're taking notes beside your points, well, then there hasn't been a response yet.
That's
and
correct.
then at the end of the debate, you can kind of look and see what was not responded to, what was, and what those responses were.
Yes.
Okay. Good job, Bill. Thank you. We'll talk some more about it next time on Reasonable Faith.